are calling, the curtain is drawn. How far we've fallen, I'm out on the run. Live in the violence, die by the sword. Deep in the fire, that's where darkness is born.
When most people around the world think about moving to Hawaii to live, it sounds like a dream come true. Hawaii is a place where natural beauty and vibrant culture converge in a way that's almost magical. Imagine waking up to the sound of waves gently lapping against sandy shores with the scent of tropical flowers carried by a warm, gentle breeze. The landscape is incredibly diverse, from pristine beaches with golden, white, or even black sand to lush rainforests brimming with exotic plants and wildlife. You can explore dramatic volcanic landscapes and immerse yourself in the rich and welcoming culture that is deeply rooted in traditions and the spirit of aloha, which means love, peace, and compassion. You're left with a lasting impression of serenity and wonder. And now I've never been to Hawaii, but my husband, who's quite the globetrotter, has several times. He's a person who's been lucky enough to have traveled all over the world, and he did that semester at sea thing in college where you go to like 27 countries. And yet he still says Hawaii is his favorite place and then one of the most beautiful places he's ever seen. And I've talked to a lot of people who share that same sentiment. So, would it surprise you at all if I told you that Hawaii ranks as a less desirable place to be stationed if you're in the armed services? That definitely surprised me, but after reading several different perspectives and talking to numerous service members, I understand why. It seems like the dissatisfaction with being stationed in Hawaii is actually somewhat dependent on your rank. The higher up you are, it seems the more pleasant your experience may be. It actually really matters if you have dependents or are single, and then a few additional factors like, are you an outdoorsy person? How often do you need to see your family back home to be happy? So the cost of living in Hawaii is so astronomical that unless you're a high-ranking service member that is making significantly more money, it can be very financially stressful to live there. And you're thinking, well, there's a cost of living allowance if you're living in places like Hawaii for service members. But unfortunately, COLA just can't keep up with the cost of living in Hawaii. If you have dependents and you're in a single income household, even that additional income you're given for those dependents doesn't seem to be enough to make ends meet. It definitely creates an atmosphere where you can't be going out, eating out. Gas and groceries are apparently like colossally priced, which tracks because if you can't grow it in Hawaii, it has to come in on boat. And then apparently the traffic there is so incredibly bad, it can take you a few hours to get just a handful of miles. And with the cost of gas, who could afford that? I Googled a gallon of milk and it said in Hawaii that it could be around like $7.99 a gallon to $9, which means I would be a dairy-free person if I lived in Hawaii, but my little boy would make me bankrupt. But what I'm getting at is if you're a lowly, brand new member of the armed services and you get stationed in Hawaii right out of basic, well, it may sound great in theory, but it may not be what you were expecting, especially if you're headed there with a wife or with a wife and children. The way I was described Hawaii by a service member was this: Hawaii is top heavy. And if you aren't military, this means that there's an excessive number of high ranking officers compared to lower ranking personnel. And this imbalance can lead to inefficiencies as resources and decision making processes may become bureaucratic and slow. But it would make sense that men headed toward retirement who can afford to live in Hawaii would opt to be stationed there and eventually retire there. Additionally, I was told it is a pretty high op tempo. Now, that's military speak for the operational tempo. To have a high operational tempo would simply mean if you're stationed in Hawaii, you're going to experience a high amount of missions, operations, and training activities that are going to take you away from home to train you to prepare for deployments. Now, these can cause a great deal of mental fatigue and emotional toll, being away from home quite a bit, physical fatigue, etc. You catch my drift. Then you also have the fact that allegedly Hawaiians are not the biggest fan of the military being there. And then you add in the excessive cost of living. It would be incredibly costly to fly back to the mainland to try and see friends and relatives back home for holidays, that type of thing. So you may become very isolated. If you have little kids, you aren't going to be doing a lot of island hopping with traffic and costs. And from everything I've read, you become isolated and get island fever within like the first year. Now, this isn't to say that some people don't love their time stationed in Hawaii. I also read that the scenery is unparalleled, and if you enjoy hiking and surfing, it's going to be your heaven. However, when you have little kids and you are in an expensive, beautiful place for those little years, you may not be utilizing a lot of the things that make it worth living in that expensive of an area, if that makes sense. Now, I live in San Diego with two little kids and we're not going anywhere. So, we love it so much. We're not moving away. We have family here, but there's quite a hefty price tag or a beach tax, as we like to call it, to live in San Diego. And right now, we're in this season with little kids. Well, we do take them to the beach a lot. I couldn't tell you anything about San Diego other than kids' stuff to do here. Because people find out I live here and they ask me about infamous restaurants or surf spots or bars. And I'm like, I don't know. I have little kids. I could tell you like a killer review of the cleanest trampoline parks and lead you to the best splash pads that San Diego has to offer. And what I mean by this is if you have little kids, it may not matter where you live because you're in the thick of it. Right? For my family, it's worth it because we plan to be here for the long haul. So, why not buy a house and work towards paying off that mortgage, make friends, ingratiate ourselves into the area, and we will explore it when our kids are older a bit more. But for a family who's being PCS to an area for a shorter period of time, 4 years or under, it may be a really rough few years. You're going to be limited somewhat in the amount you can do. I can also attest from experience, if you are in a miserable marriage with an abuser, you could live in heaven on earth and not be happy. I lived in a house on the water with a dock out back with my ex-husband near Destin, Florida, and I've never been anywhere prettier, and I've also never been more miserable in my life. So all of this to say, Hawaii can be a stressful place for a lower ranking service member who's sent there with dependents. If you're a one income family, the stress on that service member to provide must feel astronomical. While on the other hand, the stress on the parent who stays at home watching those babies while her husband is on all these missions and she's solo parenting all that time, none of it is easy and none of it makes married life any easier. Now, domestic violence is statistically more common in households where one person relies financially on the other and where the victim has limited support from family or friends. So, being stationed in Hawaii, which can increase isolation, puts a military wife at a greater risk if her partner has those abusive tendencies. When we look at the women who we know of who've been murdered since 2020, in Hawaii from service members, all of the perpetrators were young and somewhat new to military life. The first case from that time frame that I'm going to talk about was the murder of Kayla Holder, which I'm going to share on this episode. And the perpetrator of that murder was a 21-year-old Army soldier. The next murder that occurred since 2020 happened in January of 2021. I covered that in episode 9, and the victim was Selena Roth. Her murderer was 23 at the time when he brutally killed her. And while I couldn't find his date of enlistment, he was an E4 at the time of her murder, which usually takes, I believe, around 2 years of service to obtain. So again, not a long time in the service. The next murder I know of was Dana Alataibi in 2022, which I'm going to cover in one of these next episodes. Her murder was done by her estranged husband, who was, I believe, 29 at the time. I don't have his exact dates of service or his history of deployments. I'm working on getting that, and I'll share that on that episode. Additionally, today we are going to talk about the murder of a young woman named Laau Jordan Laulusa, killed in 2023 by a 25-year-old boyfriend. We'll talk more about him and what I believe was also a short time in the service. And then just this year, Misha Johnson, who was allegedly killed by her husband, he was 28 at the time of that murder. Now, again, he's not been convicted, nor has her body or the body of their baby been found. But he had attended one station unit training at Fort Moore, Georgia in November of 2022 and was signed the 25th Infantry Division in June of 2023. So, meaning a year. He'd been in Hawaii 1 year when he allegedly took this woman's life. and he'd been in the military less than 2 years. So this actually triggered some really interesting conversations between myself and my husband. We talked a lot about military recruitment and how they're grossly missing their targets for recruitment with so many things going on in this country, political upheaval, all of the things, COVID, really making people think that work-life balance should be much more balanced. All of these things. And so the military has really had to lower their standards. They're waiving aptitude tests. They're giving waivers for health issues and mental health history problems, even misdemeanors. And I find that really interesting. And so it led to a very interesting conversation. And so I'm going to do a whole episode on this subject matter in a couple days because I think it needs to be talked about. But for now, let's just focus on why young men are killing women. These men specifically, from what I know, were all under 30, and I can confirm that almost all of them, with the exception of Dana Alataibi's husband, were new to the military, and I believe all without combat PTSD, combat traumatic brain injuries. They weren't watching their buddies get their limbs blow off and having nightmares of the enemy killing them, all of these things, right? So it leads you to wonder why. And did their military service, though short, exacerbate them to become a person who would kill their significant other? And I want to talk more about this trend of young men, even teenagers, resorting to extreme violence and murder when faced with rejection. Because a lot of times, it's not that the wife is cramping their style, it's that the wife wants out or the girlfriend wants to break up. And we see the reason for women being killed again and again and again is they're trying to get out of a relationship, even teen girls. We see in these married couples, a lot of them are pregnant and the man doesn't want the responsibility or they've just had a baby. But this alarming trend seems to have really escalated since I was a teenager. And the statistics back that up. Teen violence has been on the rise since the 90s. Now, while most people are aware that domestic violence is prevalent among young adults, overwhelmingly affecting women, it might be shocking to learn how often this violence extends to teenagers. A recent study, perhaps the first of its kind, and I'll link it, it revealed that of nearly 2,000 adolescents aged 11 to 18 killed between 2003 and 2016, around 150 were murdered by current or former intimate partners. That's about 7%. That may not sound like a lot, but 7% of 11 to 18-year-olds who died were killed by intimate partners. I mean, think about how many die in car accidents, illnesses, other causes. It's alarming to realize that such a significant portion of teen deaths and preteens is due to romantic relationships. Also of note, 90% of those victims were female. The average age of victim was 17, and 80% of the perpetrators were men aged 18 or older. After this study was published, experts were surprised by the scale of adolescent violence. A significant majority of those victims were killed using firearms. In the article I read, Deborah Capaldi, a senior scientist at the Oregon Social Learning Center, noted, the lethality is largely due to gun availability. When anger and lack of control are combined with access to a gun, it often results in tragedy. So we can draw parallels to the main issue I'm here to talk about always, and that is military men killing their wives. These young men have access to firearms, and even if they're not bringing home their service weapons, I will say it is very common and very trendy for those that are infantry to purchase their own personal weapons, right? It's very popular. I guess the word is it's like seeing F-150s leave the base. Everyone's got to have one when they get their first bonus or they get their reenlistment or whatever have you. Everyone I knew who was a service member had their own personal guns and a lot of them arsenals. So these young men often have access to firearms and they lack control of their emotions. But let's go back to that study for a minute. In that study, the precipitating event leading to these deaths were mostly breakups, jealousy, and then in some cases also pregnancy, as I mentioned in a previous episode about murdered military wives. If you haven't heard that episode, I shared that when a military wife is killed, in my opinion, there's four big factors at play or a combination of any of them. She filed for divorce or she's trying to leave or break up with him. She threatened to report her husband for either cheating or domestic violence, both which could impact his career. She was pregnant or had recently had a baby, or she was even a pregnant mistress, putting the husband at risk of being caught for cheating again, even if she didn't know she was a mistress. And then four, jealousy, either because the wife was cheating or had moved on post-relationship. These same themes are prevalent in teen dating violence as well, with the main contributors being breakups and jealousy, sometimes for unrequited love even. Jealousy is obviously a significant issue in teen relationships. which is why I so often preach about the importance of teaching young people about healthy boundaries and what coercive control is. I've said it before and I'll say it again and again, but no teen should have control over another's choices, clothes, friends, or whereabouts. We should be limiting our children's text messages and access to each other. They shouldn't have access to each other's constant whereabouts and activities. I think it's so crucial to help young people understand that nobody is entitled to those constant updates on where they're at. Their partner shouldn't be answering to them. I think if we normalize that behavior and make them feel like it's normal and valid, that could lead to a trend, happening in their future relationships. So I try very hard to instill that in my little girl that nobody has autonomy over her and to set boundaries, which is tricky because she's smart and that will sometimes be used against me, but for the greater good. And I'm going to do the same for my son. Once he's older than 2, I'm going to teach him all the same things. And I think I talked about this in part 1 of this episode, so I'll just say it very quickly. But I made that TikTok where I covered 100 women who'd been killed by service members since the year 2000. And we saw this trend where early on in the 2000s, it was those combat veterans with major issues. And then as we moved into present day, it's becoming more and more these young soldiers, 21, 22, 23, zero combat or deployment, killing their wives. And I want to know, why is this happening? The study I talked about earlier also points out that individuals with really poor emotional control, hostility, and jealousy are especially dangerous during breakups. The high risk situations can turn volatile real quickly. And I think we have a lot of very young service members who have no emotional control over themselves. And that doesn't bode well. So today I'm going to share the cases of 2 women and an infant who lost their lives to young service members who obviously lacked the ability to self-regulate. And I'm sharing these stories, they're unrelated cases because unfortunately there just isn't a lot of information about either of the cases, so I don't have a lot to report. But I think it is so important that every single murdered woman's name is spoken because her murder matters, she mattered. The first woman whose name I want you to know is Kayla Holder. Kayla was a young woman and Army reservist. She moved to Hawaii in 2014 with big old dreams. She got a job, joined the reserves, enrolled in school, and started living her dream. Kayla's mother, Michelle Chamberlain, was incredibly close with her daughter, and the two talked on the phone every single day. In 2020, Kayla was 23 years old, and while I couldn't find an exact timeline of their relationship, she had started a relationship with a man 2 years her junior who was also an Army member named Kendall Rashad Ramsey. The two would go on to welcome a little boy in 2019 and name him Kai Noah Ramsey, and they would live together in an apartment in Eva Beach. In March of 2020, when little Kai Noah was just shy of 7 months old, Kendall would stab both mother and child to death in that apartment. Just hours before, a friend recalled talking to Kayla on the phone, and she was talking about what was for dinner and the baby, and everything just seemed fine. Now, I read a few people would say that there was no signs with Kayla and Kendall of abuse, but I bet if you were given a microscope onto their relationship, there would have been signs of emotional abuse, jealousy, and some controlling patterns from Kendall. Even if Kayla herself didn't know that the behavior was extremely unhealthy and even abusive, it doesn't mean it wasn't occurring. So while there's very little details that have emerged surrounding this case yet, here's what was determined after the fact. On the night of the murders in March of 2020, Kendall revealed he and Kayla had argued over something to do with the baby. Kendall had grabbed a knife at some point and stabbed both Kayla and the baby to death. He would flee in a car, and on that car ride, he would actually recklessly crash into other drivers. Both Kendall and a male and female driver would be taken to the hospital for injuries. At some point after the murders, Kendall would actually call Kayla's family and tell them through screams that both Kayla and Kainoa were dead, that he'd killed them and he was going to kill himself. And I can only imagine how unbelievably confusing and horrific that call must have been for Kayla's poor family. Now, according to EMS, the man and woman who Kendall hit in separate vehicles were in serious condition when they went to the hospital. I know they lived, but I don't know much else. So this guy was just an absolute homicidal maniac. Court documents would later show that Kendall would claim he became blacked out from drinking, but remembers fighting with Kayla about the baby, and then the next thing he said he remembered was firefighters pulling him out of his wrecked vehicle, which seems incredibly convenient to me that he lost those details in between. I just have a hard time believing he remembers the fight leading up to the stabbing, and he was able to call her family and confess to the murder and had the wherewithal to do that. But I guess a person who would murder a woman and an infant isn't going to be the most honest human. So this court was a little bizarre in how it's played out in court so far. Due to COVID and some other factors, it hasn't taken the typical path. Initially, Kendall was charged by a complaint through the prosecutor's office, but due to this sweeping ruling by the Supreme Court, his charges were too serious to be brought in that fashion, and they were required to be brought against him by a grand jury. So those initial charges were dropped without prejudice, and then he was again charged with 1 count of first-degree murder, 2 counts of second-degree murder, and 1 count of second-degree attempted murder. I think the car wrecks may be in there somewhere, I'm not exactly sure. And those charges were brought again in September of 2022, and he is still being held, thankfully without bail, and awaiting trial to this day, it would seem. I just couldn't find anything that would update on the trial. I've not seen very much at all about this case. I've seen where he made some motions to suppress statements about what was said, so I'm guessing he's going to take this trial all the way and try to get off for this, which I really think is the most cowardly thing you can do. You murdered the mother of your child and your little innocent baby, and you need to serve your time and face the music. Stand up, apologize to the family, and take it. He doesn't deserve a trial, and that's just my thought on that. If there's any updates to the trial, I will update you all on a future episode. But to Kayla and Kainoa's family, my thoughts are with you all, and I will be cheering for justice for both of them. The other case I wanted to briefly share today is one with very little information. And again, when the cases haven't gone through the judicial process or they haven't been through court-martial, it can be difficult to access a lot of information for me. I can't really FOIA anything or dig up much. But again, I wanted to share this woman's name and get her case on your radar so you can follow it. And I mentioned her name earlier, but the woman I am talking about now is a beautiful Hawaiian woman named Laau Jordan Laulusa. She chose to go by Jordan to her friends and coworkers, so I will be calling her Jordan today. Jordan was a soldier with the Army National Guard and a supply specialist for the 227th Brigade Engineer Battalion. Jordan joined the military in 2019, and she was looking forward to expanding her future with the military and traveling the world. She had a lot of big dreams. Jordan was beloved daughter, sister, and niece, and she loved her big family. In March of 2023, Jordan's body would be found with stab wounds to her neck in a burning car at Milani High School. Police say witnesses saw the suspect opening and closing doors on the car moments before the fire erupted, and the witnesses said the man was carrying a bladed weapon. When the suspect took off, the witnesses actually called 911 and followed him until police arrived and arrested him. Exactly what I would do, but probably a really bad idea. In the aftermath, a story would unfold. One of an angry, volatile young man who controlled women and had a history of making death threats and domestic violence. Police would arrest 25-year-old Samuel Jones, a specialist assigned to the U.S. Army Reserves. The military didn't disclose much else other than that. I couldn't find very much about his military experience. Now, the family didn't know a whole lot, it would seem, about Samuel, or that I could find at this point, so it's unclear how long they'd been dating. It seems like this was a new boyfriend, but an ex-girlfriend of Samuel Jones would emerge and be interviewed and provide a lot more context about who Samuel Jones was. And she would be on the evening news in Honolulu under the condition of her anonymity being kept. So they only showed waist down and hands and changed her voice. She would share that before Jones and Laulusa met, he went out with her. I'm going to call her Jenny, as it's not her name, but Jenny would disclose she was with Samuel for 3 years. And she says she saw a dark side of him that many people were unaware of. Jenny said that it took her a full year to see all of the signs clearly. It took her another year to convince herself she had to escape the relationship. And then that third year, it took the full year to actually get herself out. And I can absolutely relate to that. I did find myself going back and forth on whether or not the perpetrator could be fixed. Was it all in my mind? Was I the crazy one? Did I make it up? Was the abuse happening? And I will say there is a lot of work being done by the perpetrator, by the abuser, that leaves you questioning reality. It's very foggy. So as outsiders look at the horrific abuse and question, why hasn't this woman split as these signs were displayed early on? It's much more layered than that on the inside. So Jenny would attest that the relationship started out like many other relationships, but then Samuel began telling her more and more what she could and couldn't do. It actually got to the point where he wouldn't let her leave the house with shorts on unless he was with her. Things of that nature, that kind of control. She said one day he looked her straight in the face and said, "If you try to leave me, or if you leave me and succeed, I will find you and I will kill you." Now, this brought back a lot of flashbacks for me personally. I remember time and time again my ex husband telling me, "If I ever find out you cheat on me, nobody will ever find your body. If I ever find out you so much as kiss another guy or talk to another guy, nobody will ever find your body. We live on the water. There's a boat. How hard do you think it would be for me to get rid of you?" Those types of comments on a regular basis. He would say, "If you ever leave me, I would find you and you would disappear. Don't forget, I'm special forces." So there's a lot of conditioning happening in these types of relationships. So for Jenny, she waited until Samuel left on a trip and she filed a temporary restraining order and left him for good. But she didn't feel safe or stopped looking over her shoulder. Again, I can relate. Jenny said she's just devastated for the Laulusa family because she feels just this immense amount of guilt that she didn't warn them or warn Jordan. And I wrestled with this so much. And some of you may wrestle, some of you who are survivors of domestic violence, and you hear that your incredibly dangerous ex or psychotic ex or whatever has a new relationship, and you want to warn them so bad. But the truth of the matter is, they're probably not going to believe it coming from you because he's probably already convinced them that something is greatly wrong with you. He's got them thinking that you're just a crazy bipolar psycho. And so you're going to come out of the woodwork and say, "Hey, he is not okay. Here's proof." And they're going to have all these excuses in their head that he's planted. But as soon as I knew my ex had a new wife, I so badly wanted to just check on her and see if she was okay or if she needed help. But everybody in my inner circle would tell me, "Do not put yourself back in his crossfire. Why would you put yourself back on his radar? You've escaped." And I wanted so badly to warn her. Fast forward a decade later, we have, of course, found each other, and I'm going to forever consider her family, honestly. What we've been through both separately and together is very bonding. And her and I now wrestle with contacting the young women he gets with now. And I do mean young. These types of abusers go younger and younger and younger. I was 25 to 30 when I was with him. And then after me, the girl I call Faith, his second wife, she was 10 years younger than me. And now he's nearing 50 and he's dating 20-year-olds. And it's because it's gross because they're doing it because they can manipulate them. They're doing it because they can have power over them. There's a reason they keep going younger. And so Faith and I have really considered how we can contact family members of these girls and just send court records of the horrible things he's done. But again, for our children's safety, we're just we can't do that. But I digress. We wrestle with it, and a lot of times you just have to know these women aren't going to believe you even if you do warn them. So for this girl, Jenny, I really feel for her, but I hope she can let go of the guilt for not warning Jordan or her family. I feel like I screamed so much about the military and at the military back then that when these men kill somebody, the military is really culpable. We can't put it on the victims themselves because they do everything they can while in these incredibly trapped situations. So one of my big complaints is that these DV complaints don't seem to stick and travel base to base. If a man has DV charges, if he PCSs somewhere else, that next duty station should know. And a lot of times they don't. They don't communicate with each other. So there's a lot of work to be done. Now, just a general update about Jordan Laulusa. Samuel Jones has pleaded not guilty to murdering her, and his trial has been moved back quite a few times as his attorney has asked for additional time, despite the fact, let's say, witnesses saw this man brandishing a knife around the burnt car with Jordan's body in it. They also reported he had visible burn marks and smelled of burnt plastic. So he's pleading not guilty. He's been charged with second-degree murder and first-degree arson, and I will update you as soon as anything comes to fruition. So why are all these young men murdering? I used to assume that all of these people who committed these acts were victims of horrible abuse themselves and just products of their environments, and surely, for some of these perpetrators, that's the case. But then I went to this talk by a world-famous prosecutor recently. I may have already mentioned this on a show, but anyways, I went to this talk by a world-famous prosecutor, but he shared that a lot of people assume this when he's prosecuting these people. He hears a lot of people think that these rapists and killers, that they came from just these tormented background. But he said in reality, It's the opposite problem many times. A lot of them were just too spoiled and they gain this sense of entitlement. They literally can't take no for an answer. They can't take rejection. They think they deserve the right to everything, including a woman's body and the right to take her life. And so I find myself just looking at this juxtaposition of, are parents doing better these days because, we know better, so we do better? Or are they just enabling kids because we never let them feel pain or disappointment? It's so tough to be a parent. But what I'm learning and continually to try to do better at is not bubble wrapping my kids and protecting them from all of life's pain and disappointment. Because in turn, they could grow up with just a complete inability to handle any form of disappointment or rejection. And maybe that's not the case for these service members. I can't attest to their upbringing. But I do know we need to teach our youth about accepting when a person wants to end a relationship. Because statistically, most of these women are murdered because they're trying to leave. I believe that statistic is 75%. 75% of the time that these homicides happen, it's because a woman is trying to leave or has just left. So, on that note, I'm going to end it here, but please join me in a few days. I'm going to release an episode diving more into the recruiting tactics of the military, some of the waivers they will do, and what you may not know is happening behind the scenes to get more people to join right now. It's got some more conspiracy theories for you and whatnot. I want to thank you for listening. Again, I want to beg of you to please go rate and review my show so that some woman out there at a base around the world may land on it and see it. She may hear some similarities about what happened to some of these women and what is happening to her, and it might give her the strength to get out and get help, whatever that case may be. Please stay safe. And as I like to always say, if you're leaving, don't research anything on a phone or computer your abuser can look at the history of. They may have apps on your phone where they can see your keystrokes. Public library or borrow a friend's phone or computer, but do so carefully and just assume they're tracking you. Don't tell them you're leaving. Don't meet them for one last goodbye. Remember, you are not crazy. It is not in your head. And if you have to Google, is this abuse? It's abuse. Okay. And if you want to know if they're still going to be abusive in the future, like, are you going to leave them and they're going to find someone else in change for them? No, that's not going to happen. I can promise you. The best predictor of the future with domestic violence is the past. And lastly, if you're online dating, spend the $20 to run a background report. Okay. That's all. I promise. I'm shutting up. Until next time. Thanks.